In chapter 8.5, subsection of the business cycle chapter, this will be our last subsection. We'll be explaining these particular issues dealing with the business cycle. And in this section, we're going to be talking about long-run equilibrium as opposed to the short-run equilibriums we were describing in the previous set of slides. So let's talk about the difference between short-run and long-run. Now, some economists, especially the classical-oriented economists, argue that short-run instability is not as important as the long-run trend in economic growth, because they believe that, in fact, the economy will self-adjust. It may take some time, but the economy naturally readjusts to bring the economy back to the full employment level of output. So once it adjusts to any short-run deviation, the economy recovers and goes to its long-run growth path. So they believe, that this group of economists believe, that there's a natural rate of output that's determined by institutional factors, such as how well does your economy function, how overbearing is government regulation, how high are taxes, how easy is it for businesses to start new businesses, how much unionization is in the workforce. All of those things can either cause an economy to run well or run poorly. So the folks who focus on the natural rate, they're looking for ways to make sure that the economy's natural ability to grow is permitted to be as robust as possible, and therefore are looking for ways to dismantle things that cause economies to run slowly. They don't focus too much on what's happening in any particular recession, because they believe that that's going to solve itself, and then what we really need to focus on is what's happening with the long-run situations. So the example here would be a graph. As you can see to the right, we have the aggregate supply curve. Instead of being an upward sloping curve, is a vertical curve. Now remember, a vertical curve is not upward sloping. There's no slope to it, because in fact, as the price level goes up, as we can see in this example from P1 to P2, you notice, because there's two different demand curves here, we start at aggregate demand 1, somehow the aggregate demand jumps to aggregate demand 2, so we move from equilibrium C to equilibrium A, but you notice, where's the real output? It didn't change at all, because we're on the long run aggregate supply curve in this example is vertical. Whereas in previous lectures, since the curve was shown as a slope, when you shifted the aggregate demand curve, the new equilibrium spot would be at a different level, wouldn't it? So what's the difference here? According to the long-run aggregate supply curve, the aggregate demand cannot permanently change the total level of output, because as the aggregate demand curve increases, there's more reason for business people to produce goods and services, but we also have a rising price level. So as business people try to increase their output, not only do they have a reason to increase output, but also their costs start increasing. And so as their costs start increasing, then their reason to increase output no longer exists. And so the argument is, in the long run, aggregate demand cannot change the total level of output. All it can do is change the price level. So now we have a whole new theory here to think about. We're thinking about the difference between long run and short run. So this is a long run argument. This is saying in the long run, aggregate supply curves don't have slopes to them. In the long run, it's vertical. Now, what's the counter argument? The counter argument is, well, we live in the short run. Short run variations do affect the current economic situation. And if we are currently in a recession, most people feel impatient to just do nothing. People insist that the government get out there and fix the problem. But again, remember, this goes back to that whole argument, again, using an analogy, is the economy in a cold, does the economy have a cold, or does the economy have pneumonia? If it has a cold, what really is the best response? What should your doctor tell you to do? Heavy duty drugs? Well, of course not. Go home, rest, get plenty of fluids. In a couple days, the thing will solve itself. So don't do heavy-duty drug interventions. But if instead you have pneumonia, to have that laissez-faire attitude by your doctor would really be a sign of bad medicine, right? If you have pneumonia, you really do need some heavy-duty drugs to break the bacterial infection, or the viral infection to make sure that, in fact, you will recover. So that's where this entire debate, why it's so important. Because under one theory, the government should not be intervening, but under the other theory, then the government should be stepping in to try to shift the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve in order to bring us back to equilibrium. So, what are some of the things that we actually did during the Great Recession? So, from 2018 to 2014, remember the recession was officially over in 2009, but the recovery from 2009 to 2014 was so slow that many people refer to it as a growth recession, that the growth was so slow that, in fact, people weren't going back to work quickly enough. The theory here, the Keynesian theory, is we need to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. We need to stimulate the demand so that business people have a reason to hire more workers and increase production. And we do that through two possibilities, the fiscal policy and the monetary policy, which we have highlighted here. Fiscal policy refers to government taxing and spending power to alter the macroeconomy. Monetary policy is the use of money and credit controls to influence the macroeconomy. So the fiscal policy is the government does a spending plan, for instance, like providing long-term unemployment payments that they normally would not have done. That would be an example of a fiscal policy. Or the government says, we're going to reduce taxes to give people have more money in their paychecks so they'll go out and spend it. That would be an example of a fiscal policy. The monetary policy would be the Federal Reserve System saying, we're going to do something to lower interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. Either one of those things would have shifted the aggregate demand curve. Now, what else could we do to reduce recessions? We could try to shift the aggregate supply curve to the right, do something to reduce the cost of production or otherwise stimulate more output. We refer to those as supply side policies. Change tax incentives, do deregulation, or some other mechanism that makes the economy's ability and willingness to produce increase. Or we can do trade policies. So for instance, we could lower trade barriers. And if you lower trade barriers, then business people can import more goods and services at a lower cost, and thereby be able to produce more goods and services more cheaply, thereby stimulating the economy. All of those things would shift either the aggregate demand curve or aggregate supply curve. And then, of course, the last issue, point number 3, we could have chosen to do nothing at all. Simply let the market self-adjust over time. Now, of course, it turned out that as a practical matter, laissez-faire was never even considered. Both Republican and Democrat presidents during that time period, because all during this recession, President Bush was the president when it started. President Obama was president during most of his first term in office, was during this recession. It even lingered into his second term in office. Neither president, neither the Republican nor the Democrat, considered laissez-faire. Both presidents wanted the government to do something. And so President Bush first came up with a stimulus package, which we would call fiscal policy, where the government tried to spend a significant amount of money in the economy. And then, of course, President Obama did the same thing, had a massive fiscal stimulus package, also to try to stimulate the economy. And while many Keynesians would argue they did the right thing, apparently it did not shift the economy enough to make a huge difference. So some Keynesians said we didn't do enough to stimulate the economy, and classical economists would argue that, well, the government really has no serious ability to do these things anyway, and therefore it was a huge waste of time. So that we still have that debate, even during this recession. And then last but not least, the last slide on this particular slide deck, and also the last slide for Chapter 8. The Federal Reserve stepped in with what we call an easy money policy. Remember, easy money means the government produces enough extra money that we have a surplus of money in the banking system, making it easy to make loans because interest rates now get pushed down because we have a surplus of money, and so we now have an easy money policy. Both the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve bailed out failing companies and banks and tried to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right to try to stimulate the economy. Whatever the situation was, the recovery was very sluggish, which leads, of course, to more fuel for this debate between classical economists who want laissez-faire as the government policy versus Keynesians who want more government intervention. So unfortunately, we don't have a clear-cut winner in this debate as to which way we should go. So for now, we're going to leave this this whole concept alone and move on to new ideas. But now we have at least the idea of understanding why there's such a deep debate on whether the government should be heavily involved in the economy, stimulating it or not.